Engagers, this is Professor Game, where we interview successful practitioners of games, gamification, and game thinking who bring us the best of their experiences to get ideas, insights, and inspiration to help us in the process of using games and gamification in our daily lives, for example, to learn what we are teaching. And I am Rob Alvarez. I work at IronHack, teach at IE Business School University, and so much more, and host this podcast. If you have an extra second, please go ahead and subscribe for free to our email list at professorgame.com/subscribe. Engagers, and welcome back to another episode of the Professor Game podcast. We have with us Geoffrey Golden today, but Geoffrey, I don't know how to pronounce that. Depends on on the background and how that's used.
Absolutely. Geoffrey is how it's pronounced. Yeah. Like, let's see, in the States, we have Geoffrey Giraffe, who is the mascot of Toys R Us. There's Geoffrey Rush, Geoffrey Chaucer. So, and they're all pronounced it like the way I pronounce it. So, so that's good. So the famous way is what I'm trying to say.
Amazing. So Geoffrey is with us today, but Geoffrey, can you let us know if you're prepared to engage?
I am prepared to engage. I've got my VR gloves on. I'm putting the helmet down. I'm traveling the metaverse. Let's do it. Let's glide into the information super web 3 that's coming at us.
Amazing. And we have Geoffrey Golden with us today because he's a narrative designer and a game writer. He has past clients including Capcom, Disney, Square Enix, Ubisoft, and indie studios around the world. He's written interactive stories and games in many mediums, from consoles to comic books. Adventure Snack, which is his email newsletter RPG, has been featured in Indicate, Narrowscope, Hyper RPG, and Substack. He is based in Los Angeles and has a growing library of VCR board games. So, Geoffrey, Is there anything we're missing from that intro?
That is my whole life story. It sums me up as a person, as a three-dimensional person really well. So thank you. I appreciate that.
And this is a first timer for me. What's a VCR board game?
Yeah, what a great question. So in the 1980s, you're familiar with VCRs, I presume, or maybe not. Okay, some young people aren't even familiar with what a VCR is. So for those of you listening who don't remember, VCR was a tape player from I believe they started in the late 70s, and we have them. I mean, they're still around today, but I think they were manufacturing them into the 2000s. And basically, they were a popular home video format. So you'd get like movies or like 3 episodes of a television show on one VHS tape. So right around when video games crashed in the early 1980s, but before Nintendo sort of picks up the mantle, there's this period where people want the sort of in-home entertainment, that like interactive entertainment, but like they want something maybe a little bit more sophisticated or at least more sophisticated seeming than like an Atari game. And so there was this wave of VCR board games. I believe it started with Clue, VCR Clue. And basically, it's a board game with a linear video component. So oftentimes, the video serves as a timer, or there's like a host who interrupts the play to like make a new condition. There are ones in horror space. There are ones in there's like monster ones, action, adventure ones, mystery ones. So they run the gamut. I love them mostly for the cheesy acting. And also because I really like weird mediums when it comes to games. I really like exploring how games can be infused in different unexpected ways. And like VHS tape, which for a while in the 80s, people really wanted to crack, like how to make an interactive VHS experience. All of that history fascinates me. So yeah, I've got some great recommendations. The Wayne's World one I think is really good. The Star Trek one is also pretty good. And then there are some weird ones out there.
I'm sure.
So stay away, unless you really are a masochist. Stay away from the Rap Rat. You don't want to know what Rap Rat is like. I mean, now you'll be curious. The listener at home, will be like, well, You don't tell me not to look at Rap Rat. I'll look at Rap Rat whenever I want to look at Rap Rat. I'll tell you, though, you'll regret it, but by all means, go for it.
Amazing. So basically, we always quickly start with, getting to know you a little bit more, and it's something of your daily life. But I think our VCR and VHS are the same technology, right?
Yes, that's correct.
So we now know this VCR VHS history of you, and I think we know you a little bit better after this small chat around the subject. So we'll dive right in, right?
That's right.
Diving right in means asking you about a story of what we like to call maybe your favorite fail or your first attempt in learning. One of those times where things didn't go your way. How did you get out of it? What did you learn from that? We want to be there in the ground level with you. You don't have to name specific names, but we want to be there taking the lessons and the punches as well with you.
The first thing that comes to mind with failure is an adventure. So it was with Adventure Snack in the early years of Adventure Snack. So Adventure Snack, it's an email newsletter where I send my players interactive fiction games. So think like choose your path adventures that you could play on your lunch break. And if you want to get a sense of it, you can go to adventuresnack.com and you can see over 75 games in the archives that you can play right now. So every year with Adventure Snack, I do a reader survey at the end of the year. And in the reader survey, I found that several of my players, they said they wanted something more long form. So a lot of the Adventure Snack games, they're short and they're funny. Again, play them on your lunch break, play them while you're waiting in line, at the bank or whatever. It's sort of a shorter experience. But several players did come out and say, we want something longer. And so I thought, okay, the following year I would do an experiment and I would do a 2-part Adventure Snack that was more serious in tone and that where the choices you make from the first week would spill over into the second week. And so you would have this sort of a feeling of a bigger, broader narrative. And the game was called Flashing Red. So it took place on a spaceship that was about to explode, basically. And you are, it was put into self-destruct mode. And you are trying to survive, but you could also potentially save others. But you're a captive on this spaceship. So, it becomes a moral question of, who to save and why. It was tonally very different from the typical adventure snack. Usually, to give you an idea, like this week I released an adventure snack called You Are a Zombie Yelp Reviewer. Or other ones include like Bigfoot is Your Landlord. So this is like this game that I was working on, this 2-part game, tonally very different. But I spent a lot of time on it. And, the technology, so my email service provider is Substack. And Substack has there's a lot of great things about Substack. I do like the platform. But it's not very tech focused in terms of like feature. It's not feature rich. It's purposely stripped down to make it easier to use. But for example, if I was sending these interactive fiction emails on a platform like MailChimp, there are certain things I could save in a database, like in the back end, that I could then use in a following email. So I could like automatically sort the players who chose one thing or another thing into a category and then send different emails to people depending on the choices that they made in the branch, right? But I couldn't do that. So it was all very much, like classic game book style where it's like, okay, like, remember this password for next week, kind of thing. So I released the game and it was absolutely like a flop. It's still today, if you look at my list on, I believe it's like adventuresnack.substack.com/archive. If you look at my list, you can sort them by most popular. And those 2 games are among the least popular. I think one of them is actually the least popular Adventure Snack. And so this is what I took away from it. At first, I was frustrated. And it's like, well, people said that they wanted a deeper experience. And I gave it to them and they rejected it. And then I realized 2 things. One was that just because it was a deeper experience mechanically didn't mean that it had to be a more serious game. It didn't mean I had to make it more darker and more serious. It was an experiment in tone, But I think that was a major sort of error on my part, was being like, oh, let me just change this whole spirit of what this is. Because that game tonally just did not feel like like an adventure snack game. But then the other major thing was realizing, like, mechanically speaking, this format, the email format, wasn't really right for a more ambitious narrative branching game like that in terms of the way I was structuring it. And so I started realizing that it was much better to keep most of the mechanics out of the email themselves and put them into WordPress. WordPress can handle a lot more mechanics. It's much more flexible. And so I started sort of expanding, rather than trying to cram all of the mechanics, roll a dice, do this or do that, into the email. Instead, I started building wherein one choice was in the email, and then that would lead you to the more complex branching stuff on the WordPress pages when you click through. And that has worked super well. And previous surveys, I've asked that question about, like, whether, and almost nobody responds that they wish the adventure snacks were longer, because I have made them longer, just more naturally, just sort of flowing with the tide of the medium, as opposed to trying to work against the medium, which is, like, I think what those early games did. I think instead I sort of built complexity in a way that was more intuitive.
Amazing. So it was both a combination of what you were able to do from a game design perspective, or a game writing perspective as well, with what the actual technology was about and what was the flexibility that this was allowing you to have. So I think it's a beautiful lesson in that sense. And of course, it is definitely a lesson of,
trying
things out.
Absolutely. I don't regret it. Like, I don't regret trying it. From that experience, I learned quite a bit about design. I think about, like, the classic Nintendo library, and I think about, like, the genres of game that did really well, particularly like platformers, say, versus like genres that maybe you didn't see that much. Anything with, like, a very long story, with a lot of, like, narrative, usually were not, successful. And it's just the nature of the platform, right? You want to build to the strengths of the platform, as opposed to trying to, I'll show that platform, I'll make this. It's like, it's like, no, like, let's look at the tools that come in the platform's toolbox and build with those in mind.
Makes sense. Look at the restrictions that you have in your design. And let's flip it around and go for a quick story of actually something that went well. Like, we want to see one of those big successes that you've had, which I'm sure are plenty. And perhaps, again, anonymized or not, whatever you want to go for, we want to be there with you. We want to see perhaps some of the success factors, some of the things that you would maybe say, oh, this went well because of this and that. We want to be there with you and be excited about you making that win.
Yeah. I'd like you to be there with me too. From a design perspective, one project I really like how it came out was Q the Cleverbot, which is an educational robot toy that I worked on. This would have been a couple years ago. And I love it. I have him on my desk. He's really cute. He's sort of like like five bubbles, like white bubbles all put together. Q rolls around. He has multiple different personalities that you can take, and he teaches kids how to program. So that's the big thing, is that you learn how to program with Q. And I remember the initial design meetings, because I was hired because they wanted some games that folks could play, like kids could play with their Q, to give them a sense of, like, how to use Q. So they were sort of tutorial games. And then the idea is they would play these stories, and then they would make stories and games of their own. And I remember talking about it with the creative director, and I was like, what's fascinating to me about this is you talk to Q through your app. So you can push buttons and Q will respond to you. And Q can respond in real time. And I was like, You know what? This reminds me of when I was a kid and I had a Teddy Ruxpin toy. And, Teddy Ruxpin was the talking bear. You'd put a cassette tape in, he could talk to you. But the thing is, you couldn't talk back to Teddy Ruxpin. Like, you couldn't have a conversation with Teddy Ruxpin. And it occurs to me that, like, this is an opportunity to create a conversation with the kid and their toy. And I thought of my training before I was a game writer. I did comedy improv, and I thought, like, oh, that's what this should feel like. Like, it should feel like an improv scene that the kid is having with their toy, with their Q robot. How cool would that be? And so that was sort of what we agreed on, that was going to be our guiding star in terms of the design principle. And so I started writing with that in mind, and I looked at, like, what Q could do. Like, all of the different, like, things. Q can dance in funny ways. Like, Q can light up. Q can light up. Q can cut different color lights. Q can find its way around various corners and do neat things. And so I sort of, like, looked at all the features list, and then I was like, okay, like, what's like a compelling story that we can tell that can kind of demonstrate all of these capabilities for kids so that they'll want to create a game kind of like this. And I remember one game sticks out for me. We did, I think, a series of games that folks were able to download from their app store. And so we did a series of them. And one of them I really liked, which was that Q is hacked. So your clever bot all of a sudden starts, like, flashing red. Its eyes, like, to have, like, X's on it. It starts, like, spinning around randomly. And then, like, you start getting messages from the hacker via your phone, and you have to sort of navigate a story where you trick this hacker, and you trick the hacker by programming Q in certain ways and, like, creating puzzles with Q that sort of break Q out of its spell, so to speak, and sort of crack the code to get into Q's main base so we can kick the rogue hacker off. And I remember playing it, and it worked. It was such, like, a complex, it's, like, way more complex than a lot of game projects I work on, because it had, like, this whole fourth dimension element of, like, a physical object that, like, is moving in real space. But I remember being, like, really proud of it and being like, yeah, like, this is really cool, because not only going to inspire, kids to program, which I think would be incredible, but also I think it was just interesting from, like, the idea of, a robot scene partner for improv. Like, that's, like, a neat thing. And I feel like with the way, like, AI tech is going, like, a GPT-3 comedy robot, probably. I mean, I think that may be coming. So anyway, it was just a really mind-opening project for me.
Sounds like an amazing one as well. So thank you for that story. And Geoffrey, with all this experience that you have in game writing and creating games and gameful experiences, when you're facing a new project, do you have some form of a process? Like, how does it look like? You're facing a new project. What do you do? What are the steps that you follow?
Right. Well, first things first is I have to absorb. So oftentimes, as the game writer or the narrative designer, we are usually not the first hire. Usually the vertical slice of the game, the initial sort of complex demo, fully fleshed out demo that was used to get investors on board. Usually that was created prior to the narrative designer coming on board. Depends on the genre. So oftentimes there is artwork, there is design docs, there are all these things that I need to read and absorb and ask questions about and get a sense of. Because, my job as a narrative designer, I always see it as helping the player fall in love with the game's core mechanics. So we're using story to encourage players to engage with the mechanics more. That's like 90% of the way I see of what I see is the work. And so I need to understand those mechanics. I need to understand on a base level what it is that the player is going to want to do, what it is the player can do, and how and why, or rather, and how. And then I help answer the question of why. That's where I think we come in. It's the why. Why is the player doing this? And the answer is, from my perspective, to complete a story, to feel like they are part of a universe, to explore a world. Those narrative questions they're hooks, that keep the player engaged. So first thing I do, I absorb and I ask questions. And then from there, the paths really branch wildly depending on the project. So, for example, I may be asked to work on a mobile game, right? The mobile game, all they might need are like some quests. It's like an already existing game, and they just want to expand the content, right? It's like, well, okay. In that case, I'm, reading what the work that's come before. And then I'm putting together pitches for my creative director of like, here are ideas for potential quests. Or if they already know what those ideas are, they already have those story treatments, then it's just sitting down and working on the script, working on the interactive script. So a mobile project might be very short. I've worked on some longer and more complex mobile projects too, but there are short games. There are also games that don't need a narrative designer for maybe an extended length of time. For example, I might work on an FPS where really all they need are barks. They just need things for the player to say at certain moments. And it's a big sheet of barks. In that case, I am reading.
For those out there who don't know what that is, can you give us a quick of what that barks is?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So your character gets hit with a bullet. Write 5 barks. Barks would be, ooh, that hurts. Or, oh, I took one in the stomach. Or it's like, darn it, not again. Or, ooh, another one of those and I'm toast. That kind of line, like those, the little things that they say when they get hit by the bullets, generally speaking. So like that may be very short, that maybe I'm reading character guides, character bios that maybe somebody else has written to get a sense of, the character and then writing from there. But then other times there'll be longer projects like role-playing games or story-driven games, narrative branching games, where I might be asked to come in at the very beginning of the project. In that case, after absorbing materials, one thing I might be doing is writing character bios, writing story treatments, if the game is has a linear narrative, as opposed to say an open world, writing world building docs. A lot of the work in the early days of narrative driven games are generally the story Bible. It's these guides that not only does the narrative department need, but also other departments rely on them as well. So I'm writing character bios, right? I'm also trying to paint a picture of this character for the art team so that the artists who are doing the character designs and the animation cycles have an understanding of the character's personality. So it's a tough question to ask because I've worked in so many different genres. It really depends. It's like I understand the question and it's tricky because if for movies, television, screenwriting is an art form that is across genre pretty similar. Generally there are formulas, there are patterns of work. Studios tend to have similar processes, whereas in games, game studios may have rapidly different processes just in terms of scripting the game. Some may ask you to work in Engine, others ask you to work in a Google spreadsheet. There's little consensus about how to put these things together from studio to studio. So yeah, it can really depend.
Sounds amazing. So basically adapting to what others have, and depending on your involvement, it might look like this or look like that. Is that a fair, though very, very summarized summary of what you said?
Yeah, that's the Cliff Notes version. And it's very well summarized, by the way. What took me to 40 minutes to describe, you did it in a sentence. So well done. That sort of conciseness will help you when writing game dialogue, which generally has to be shorter due to character limits. So yeah, and also localization. So yeah.
Amazing. Just a quick break before we continue. Are you enjoying this podcast? If you're listening through a podcasting app, please subscribe and rate us on the app. This will be of great help to reach more engagers so we can change the world together through gamification. So, Geoffrey, would you say that there is some sort of best practice, one of those things that, that would make your game design, your game scripting, your game writing at least a little bit better if you implement? If I were to ask you that thing, what would be your reaction, basically?
My first reaction is tension. It's conflict. It's just classic dramatic writing 101. What do these characters want? How are they going to get it? And what obstacles are in their way? Knowing that can get you through a lot. When you're writing scenes, when you are crafting plots, we're thinking in terms of, we're thinking in terms of goals, player goals, character goals, which are hopefully aligned. And then we know there's going to be conflict. Generally speaking, it's a video game. There's conflict of some kind, even if it isn't, slaying monsters. It might be a bad harvest. It might be the bunny won't share with you, won't share their bread with you or whatever. That these are all dramatic conflicts. And so understanding that scenes and plots need those conflicts, and then figuring out how are the characters going to surmount those obstacles. And hopefully in your game, they will surmount the obstacles using the mechanics that are present. And when you have a story where the mechanics are built in to the narrative, that is very satisfying. That is a satisfying game experience.
There you go. Thank you for that recommendation and keeping up with those recommendations. After hearing these questions, is there somebody that you would be curious to hear on this podcast answering the same question? So sort of a future guest for Professor Game.
Professor Game, I'm happy to talk to you about that. I'm happy to recommend folks, but I don't like to put folks on the spot on the air. It's because they may, I don't know their situation. They may be shy. They may not want to be interviewed. And so being like, hey, I shouted you out on a podcast, you should do it, might be like a terrifying experience. So I'm happy to give you a recommendation, but maybe we'll do it offline if that's okay.
Gotcha. That's okay. And since we cannot recommend folks to come on the podcast, I'm sure you can recommend a book for the engagers to read and, of course, tell us why.
Absolutely. A book I'd recommend that I really enjoyed reading was Blood, Sweat, and Pixels by Jason Schreier, as I think how his last name is pronounced, and forgive me if I mispronounced it, Jason. Assuming you're listening to this, and the odds are 100%. It's a great book, and it's stories about the development of games. And I think for anybody who is interested in, especially for somebody who's interested in a career in games, but maybe is thinking about it, but doesn't know quite what it entails, or even other industry devs who have never worked on an indie game or who have never worked on a AAA game. His stories really run the gamut across the industry, which is what I really like about it. He doesn't just focus on, these are stories about the development of a Blizzard game. Like he looks at the Shovel Knights and the Blizzards of the world and the Diablos of the world to try to get a sense of what are some of the commonalities in the game development process. And I think it's really helpful to understand what other teams go through when working on a project. So you have the benefit of understanding that experience so that you can make recommendations and such for when you're working with a team.
Amazing. And This tends to be a difficult question for some of our guests because, we tend to like games for some reason. And it has to do with, what would you say is your favorite game?
Ooh, yeah, my favorite game, like of all time. I'm going to say a game that I first discovered relatively recently may well be my favorite game of all time at this point. It's called Hypnospace Outlaw. It is a visual novel type game, but it's not structured like a classic visual novel. It takes place in an alternate past wherein we use the internet in our sleep. And the internet is sort of a GeoCities meets America Online-esque, like retro future internet space. The player is hired as a content moderator to go to different users' pages and flag content as being inappropriate for various reasons. And the thing I love about the game, besides the overall aesthetics of it, it has a lot of there's like MP3s that you download that are like funny parodies of various, there's mini games, like a Pokemon got to catch 'em all type experience across this universe. But what I really love about it is that it's the story of a community. You see how your actions as a content moderator affect this community of internet users at large. And community is a space that isn't explored as much in game narrative. A lot of stories are about, a hero or a small group of heroes who fight the odds and defeat some kind of evil, and save the day. And this game is about the ripple effects that our actions have on others. A fascinating space for game story. And it's beautifully written. It's hilarious. The illustration style is really retro and funny. And you'll if you remember GeoCities and the early internet, you will be like, it's like a time warp. It's so cool. And there's a lot of mini games and surprises in it. So yeah, that would be my recommendation. It's certainly a favorite of mine.
Amazing. Thanks for that one as well. And Geoffrey, before we take off, let us know where we can find more about you. Of course, if you have any final words for the engagers, and then we'll say that it's game over.
I'll say engagers, stay engaged. It's easy, I think, to, if you're feeling a little burned out working in games, if you're feeling like it's tough, do whatever you can to treat yourself well. Take a walk. To stretch, eat well, try to sleep well, take your vacation time and don't let people pressure you into not doing it. It's a hard business at times. It's challenging, but it can be really wonderful when it's fun. It's the most fun. So stay engaged and support each other, help each other, help your colleagues, not just to get into games or get jobs, but also to thrive in those positions. You can find me on Twitter at Geoffrey Golden. That's GEOFFREY, like the giraffe, and GOLDEN, like the color. And Adventure Snack is my newsletter. I send it out twice a month. New quests 2 times a month, completely free. And you can get that at adventuresnack.com.
Amazing. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge, your understanding, your expertise, and your stories for sure, Geoffrey. However, as you know, the engagers know already as well. For now, and at least for today, it is time to say that it's game over. Hey, engagers, thank you for listening to the Professor Game podcast. And if you want more interviews with incredible guests like Geoffrey, please go to professorgame.com/subscribe and get started on our email list for free. That way we can be in contact and you will be the first to know of any opportunities that we might have for you. And remember, before you go on to your next mission, remember to follow using your favorite podcast app. Follow Professor Game, the Professor Game podcast, through that app and listen to the next episode of Professor Game. See you there.